The sun was setting over the quiet town of Grimwood, casting long golden rays that bathed the streets in warm hues of amber and crimson. The sky, once a brilliant blue, had softened into a gradient of orange, pink, and deepening purple as the last remnants of daylight stretched across the rooftops. Shadows lengthened, creeping along the cobblestone streets, swallowing the corners of the old town as evening took hold. Grimwood, a town known for its slow pace and timeless charm, was settling into the stillness of dusk. The buildings, aged by years of wind and rain, stood lined along the narrow roads, their facades bearing the wear of time. Some houses had shutters that swung gently in the breeze, creaking softly, while others had ivy crawling up their stone walls, their leaves whispering against the glass windows. The air carried the scent of burning wood and fresh bread, a sign that the townspeople were returning home, preparing for the night ahead. Somewhere in the distance, the faint clang of a blacksmith's hammer echoed, likely finishing the last order of the day. A gentle murmur of voices could be heard from the small cafe on the corner, where a few remaining patrons lingered over their evening meals, their conversations dissolving into the cooling air. A man walked alone down the street. He was of short stature, a man with dwarfism, moving steadily along the uneven cobblestones with a practiced ease. In his hands, he carried a cloth grocery bag, worn from years of use. It seemed slightly frayed but still strong. The bag was filled with the simple necessities he had purchased from the small store in the town square. A freshly baked loaf of bread, its crust golden and crisp, peeked out from the top, wrapped in brown parchment. A wedge of sharp cheese rested at the bottom, its aroma faint but familiar. A handful of apples, their skins smooth and taut, rolled gently against the glass bottle of ale nestled beside them. His grip on the bag was firm but relaxed. There was no hurry in his step. This was his town, a place he knew as well as the back of his hand. The streets, the buildings, the very air around him were familiar, comforting in their predictability. He had walked this path countless times before, his route unchanged, his mind at ease as he made his way home. Despite the time of day, the streets were quiet. Most of the townsfolk had already retired to their homes, their windows glowing warmly with the flickering light of oil lamps and candles. A few figures still moved about. A young woman pulling laundry from a line behind her house, an elderly man sitting on his porch, pipe in hand, watching the sun disappear beyond the hills. A couple strolled along the far side of the street, their voices low, their laughter soft, lost to the breeze. The town was winding down, preparing for the stillness of night. As the man walked, his boots tapped softly against the cobblestones, the sound rhythmic, steady. The evening air was cool, crisp against his skin, carrying with it the distant scent of pine from the forest that bordered the town. Above, the first stars began to prick through the darkening sky, faint specks of silver against the deepening blue. He adjusted the weight of his grocery bag, shifting it slightly in his grip. The bottle of ale inside clinked faintly against the cheese, a small, familiar sound that seemed to echo in the empty street. He exhaled slowly, his breath visible in the cooling air. The road ahead stretched onward, leading him toward home. A home that waited for him, its fireplace unlit, its rooms quiet. He continued walking, unaware of anything unusual, unaware of any hidden danger. Just walking through the peaceful streets of Grimwood, toward the warmth of his own solitude. The night settled over Grimwood, stretching long fingers of darkness into the empty streets. The last flickers of warm light from shop windows had faded, leaving only the occasional glow of a street lamp to push against the gloom. The town, usually quiet after sunset, felt different tonight, charged, restless, as if it knew something was coming. And something was coming. The low growl of engines rumbled in the distance, a deep, rolling thunder that echoed between the buildings. It wasn't the sound of a single motorcycle. It was many. A pack. The Ironclaws were here. Their arrival was announced not just by the roar of their bikes, but by the way the town seemed to shrink in their presence. People who had lingered outside hurried back into their homes, doors shutting, curtains drawn. Those still in the streets moved quickly, heads down, avoiding eye contact, hoping to become invisible. Because everyone in Grimwood knew what happened when the Iron Claws came to town. They weren't just another biker gang. They weren't rowdy travelers passing through. They were predators. They didn't come for business. They didn't come for fun. They came to hunt. Tonight, they wanted trouble. Their bikes roared through the narrow streets, the smell of burnt rubber and gasoline trailing behind them. Their leather jackets bore their signature emblem, a snarling wolf, its claws outstretched, ready to tear into flesh. The sound of their laughter, harsh, sharp, bounced off the walls as they swerved recklessly around corners, looking for someone or something to amuse them. And then one of them saw him, a man with a scar running down his cheek, jagged and pale against his rough skin. His cold eyes flicked across the street and locked onto a lone figure walking beneath a dimly flickering street lamp. A dwarf, Jindrik, carrying a grocery bag, walking alone. Scarface's lips curled into a slow grin. Well, look at this. He revved his engine, the guttural snarl of his bike splitting the silence. The other bikers slowed, their eyes following Scarface's gaze. It took them only a second to see what had caught his attention. Then came the laughter. Loud, cruel. Scarface leaned forward, gripping the handlebars of his bike as he let out a whistle, sharp and piercing. Hey, boys, looks like we found our entertainment for the night. The engines rumbled as the gang changed direction, their bikes weaving toward Jindrik like a pack of wolves closing in on prey. Jindrik heard them before he saw them. The growl of the engines, the laughter, the danger in their voices. He turned his head, just slightly, just enough to see them approaching. And then they were all around him. The bikes circled him like vultures, the gang moving as one, engines revving, headlights flashing in his face. The smell of leather, sweat, and exhaust filled the air. Scarface cut his engine first. The others followed his lead, their laughter settling into expectant silence. Then Scarface swung his leg off his bike and stepped toward Jindrik, his boots scraping against the pavement. He was tall, his frame lean but strong, his jacket worn and heavy with patches. His scar pulled at the corner of his mouth when he smirked, making the expression look even crueler. He took his time, looking Jindrik up and down like he was studying him, taking in every detail, his stature, his clothes, the way he held his grocery bag just a little too tightly. Then Scarface let out a chuckle, shaking his head. Well, ain't this a sight? The others chuckled behind him, shifting on their bikes, waiting. Scarface took another step forward. What the hell are you doing out here, little guy? More laughter. Jindrik said nothing. Scarface's smirk widened. Oh, I get it. You just out for a little midnight stroll, huh? Another biker, a hulking man with a shaved head, leaned forward on his handlebars. Maybe he got lost, he sneered. Maybe he's looking for his mommy. Laughter erupted. Scarface tilted his head. You lost, little man. Jindrik met his gaze, his grip tightening around the grocery bag. No. Scarface let out a low whistle. Feisty one. A biker with tattoos running up his neck grinned. But he's got a lot of fight in him. Maybe we should see how much. Scarface grinned. Maybe we should. He stepped even closer. The space between them was gone now. His boots almost touched Jindrik's. Tell me something, short stack, he said, voice low, casual like they were old friends. You ever been on a real man's bike before? Behind him, the others chuckled darkly. Scarface tilted his head, pretending to think. Hell, maybe we ought to take you for a little ride. The tattooed biker revved his engine. Yeah, show you how real men move. More laughter. Scarface leaned down, lowering his voice to a whisper. How about it, little man? You want to ride with the big boys? Silence stretched. The bikers were waiting for his reaction, waiting for him to break. Scarface's smile sharpened. Then, ever so slowly, he reached out and grabbed Jindrik's bag. The air in Grimwood had turned thick with tension, suffocating in its weight. The streetlights flickered weakly, their dim glow barely holding back the darkness that pressed in from all sides. The Iron Claws had the town in their grasp, their motorcycles now silent, their shadows stretching long and jagged across the pavement like blackened claws reaching for their prey. In the center of it all stood Jindrak, small, alone, cornered. The gang encircled him, their leering faces illuminated by the soft orange light of a nearby street lamp. Scarface, the leader, stood directly in front of him, fingers curled around the strap of his grocery bag, an amused smirk playing at the edges of his scarred lips. The others shifted restlessly on their feet, boots scuffing against the pavement, eager, waiting, sensing blood in the water. They had found their target for the night. Jindrak's grip tightened around the bag, though he knew it was futile. His pulse pounded in his ears, drowning out the distant hum of the town behind him. He had lived his whole life enduring moments like this. The stares, the whispers, the laughter, the constant reminder that he was different, that the world was not built for men like him. He had learned to navigate it, to steel himself against it, to move through life as if the weight of mockery didn't crush him with every step. But this was different. This wasn't whispered insults behind his back. This wasn't the quiet exclusion he had learned to accept. This was violence waiting to happen. Scarface gave the bag a light tug, just enough to make Jindrak stumble forward. His gang erupted into laughter, the sound bouncing off the buildings, filling the empty streets like a cruel symphony. "Come on, little man. Show us you got some fight." Jindrak said nothing. Scarface leaned in closer, his whiskey-laced breath hot against Jindrak's face. His voice dropped, just loud enough for him to hear. "Tell me, Short Stack, you ever been scared before?" Jindrak held his ground, his heart hammering so violently he was sure they could hear it. He would not break. But before he could respond, a sound cut through the night. A growl. Low, deep, predatory. It rolled through the air like distant thunder, vibrating in his bones, raw and unmistakably dangerous. The laughter stopped. Scarface's smirk faltered. The gang turned their heads toward the sound, their amusement momentarily replaced by something else, something instinctive, buried deep in their bones, something older than their leather jackets and steel machines. The forest loomed at the edge of the town, its tree leaves swallowed in shadows. It stood like a wall of darkness, impenetrable, unknowable. And from within that blackness, something moved. A figure emerged, stepping out of the trees and into the dim light of the street lamp. A wolf, but not just any wolf. It was massive, its thick coat dark as ink, rippling with muscle beneath its fur. Its eyes gleamed, reflecting the glow of the streetlights, two golden orbs that burned with something unnatural, something almost human in its intensity. It walked with the slow, unshaken confidence of a predator that had never known fear. The wolf did not hesitate. It did not pause to assess. It moved with purpose, and then, as if it had always belonged there, it positioned itself between Jindrak and the gang. A silent declaration, a line drawn in the sand. The iron claws stared at the animal in disbelief. Then Scarface laughed. It was sharp, amused, slicing through the thick air like a blade. The tension snapped as the others joined in, their laughter rolling like thunder. "Are you shitting me?" Scarface chuckled, shaking his head. "This your bodyguard, little man?" Tattooed biker wiped a tear from his eye. "Oh, this is too good. Short Stack here's got himself a guard dog." Big guy cracked his knuckles. Maybe it's his big brother. The laughter swelled, louder, crueler. Scarface took a step forward, his gaze flicking to the wolf. "All right, Mutt. I don't know what kind of freak show you crawled out of, but you picked the wrong fight." The wolf did not move, did not blink. Its stance was low, its tail motionless. Not aggression, but certainty. Scarface rolled his shoulders. "All right, boys. Let's put this thing down." The gang shifted, their posture changing, shoulders squaring. Their bravado was still there, but it was different now. Forced, a cover for something else. Big guy stepped forward. The wolf's ears twitched. Scarface smirked. "You know, I hear some of these things make good rugs." More laughter. Big guy lunged. The wolf moved like lightning. One moment it was still, the next, a blur of muscle and teeth. It slammed into Big Guy's side, the impact sending the towering man stumbling back. He barely had time to react before the wolf let out a snarl, low and primal, lips curled back to reveal razor-sharp fangs. The laughter died instantly. Big Guy steadied himself, stunned. His hand went to his belt, where a knife gleamed under the street lamp. Scarface raised a hand. "Don't move." The gang froze. The wolf lowered its head, staring them down. Its breath was slow, controlled, each exhale misting in the cold air. Scarface's expression had changed. The smirk was gone. The amusement had drained from his eyes. Because now this wasn't funny anymore. This wasn't some harmless prank on a dwarf. This was something else. Something unnatural. The wolf wasn't afraid of them. And that was a problem. Scarface took a slow step back, his gang watching him carefully, waiting for the order. But he didn't give it. Because he knew. They all knew. They had pushed too far. And now, standing between them and their would-be victim, was something willing to push back. The night air in Grimwood had turned electric, thick with something raw and primal. The town was asleep, unaware of the storm brewing in its streets, the collision of predator and prey unfolding beneath the dim glow of the street lamps. The iron claws had circled their target, a man they saw as nothing more than a joke, an easy conquest, someone they could break apart for their own amusement. But now, everything had changed, because between them and their victim, between their cruel laughter and the humiliation they had planned, stood something they had not expected. A wolf. Massive. Powerful. Unshaken. It had come from the shadows like an omen, stepping into the space between Jindrak and the gang, as if it had been summoned by fate itself. It did not flinch under the gang's taunts, did not back down when Scarface and his men mocked it. And when Big Guy stepped forward, reaching for his knife, Scarface had hesitated. Because he knew. They all knew. They had gone too far. But some men were too stupid to understand fear when it was staring them in the face. And so, one of the bikers lunged. He grabbed for Jindrak, his thick fingers curling around the dwarf's jacket, ready to yank him forward, ready to tear him from the protection of the wolf and drag him back into their twisted game. And that was his mistake. The wolf moved. It was a blur of muscle and fur, an explosion of power that ignited the night in a violent rush. In a single bound, it collided with the biker, its full weight slamming into his chest like a battering ram. The force ripped the man off his feet. He let out a strangled yell as he crashed to the pavement, the impact knocking the air from his lungs. His head hit the ground with a dull thud, his helmet rolling away with a hollow clatter. The wolf did not stop. It was on him in an instant, its fangs inches from his throat, a deep, earth-shaking snarl tearing from its chest, vibrating through the pavement beneath them. For the first time that night, the iron claws felt something other than arrogance. They felt fear. "Get off him!" Scarface's voice cut through the shock, his amusement from before gone, replaced with something sharp and furious. One of the others, tattooed biker, his arms covered in inked snakes and skulls, reacted first. Steel flashed in the dim light. A knife, drawn fast, held firm his grip. His eyes locked onto the wolf. And for the first time that night, Jindrak saw something other than cruel amusement in the biker's gaze. Rage. Humiliation. The gang was used to control, used to choosing their victims. But now they had been challenged. And that they could not allow. The blade swung downward, aimed for the wolf's flank. A strike meant to cripple, to wound, to end the fight before it could begin. But the wolf was faster. So much faster. It spun, powerful legs, shifting, twisting, and before the blade could connect, it struck. The wolf's jaws clamped down around the biker's forearm, teeth sinking deep into flesh. A wet, sickening crunch filled the air. The biker let out a howl of agony, his body arching backward, his knife clattering onto the pavement. His arm, his dominant arm, was useless now. The wolf held on, shaking its head once, ripping at tendons, muscle, breaking him. And in that moment, for the first time that night, the iron claws realized what they were up against. This was not a pet. This was not a joke. This was not something they could intimidate or hurt or break. This was something they could not control. Kill it. Scarface's voice cracked through the night like a whip, laced with something he never thought he would feel, desperation. And suddenly, everything moved at once. Another biker lunged, swinging a steel chain through the air, aiming to wrap it around the wolf's throat. The wolf dropped the wounded man, spinning just in time. The chain whistled through the air, missing its target by inches. Another flash of movement. Big guy, his arm raised, something metal in his grip, brass knuckles. The punch came fast, aiming for the wolf's head. But again, it was too slow. The wolf dodged, and then it retaliated. Its teeth sank into his thigh, deep, cutting into flesh and muscle. Big guy's scream shattered the air, his balance ripping away from him as the wolf's powerful body twisted, dragging him down. He hit the ground hard, his massive frame crashing against the pavement like a felled tree. The gang panicked. Men who had, just minutes ago, mocked the wolf, laughed at Jendrik, called him worthless, weak, nothing. Now they stumbled back, eyes wide, breath shaking. "Boss, what do we do?" Scarface was silent, because he didn't know. This was not how this night was supposed to go. This was supposed to be easy. A joke. A lesson to a man who had no place in their world. But now the lesson was theirs. And as Scarface watched his men fall, as he saw the blood, as he heard their screams, he knew one thing for certain. If it didn't end this now, it would end them. The night in Grimwood was no longer silent. The deep growl of motorcycles had been replaced by the sound of labored breathing, pained groans, and the low, heavy hum of tension that hung thick in the air like mist before a storm. The battle had been swift, brutal, a collision of predator and prey that had left the Iron Claws in disarray. The gang, once so certain of their dominance, had been broken. Their cruel smiles had twisted into grimaces of pain, their arrogant taunts replaced by silence. The streets that had once echoed with their laughter were now littered with the fallen, the ones who had challenged the wrong beast and had suffered for their arrogance. And at the center of it all, Jendrik stood still. His chest rose and fell with deep, controlled breaths, his fists still clenched, his body rigid from the weight of it all. Around him, the wreckage of the night lay scattered, the broken, the beaten, the humiliated. But despite the chaos, his gaze remained locked on the wolf beside him. It had not left his side. The beast that had emerged from the darkness had done what no one else ever had. It had fought for him, stood for him, defended him when the world had never offered him that mercy. And now, with the battle finished, the wolf simply stood, its golden eyes unwavering, its breathing steady, as if waiting for something unseen. Then sirens. A sharp, piercing wail sliced through the heavy air, cutting through the thick silence like a blade. The sound was distant at first, muffled, but then it grew, closer, louder, relentless. Red and blue lights began to flicker in the distance, bouncing off the darkened windows of the buildings, illuminating the shattered scene in flashes of color. The gang members reacted immediately. There was no hesitation. The second the sirens reached their ears, their instincts screamed one word: run. Panic set in like wildfire. Those who could still move scrambled to their feet, stumbling, cursing, clawing at their bikes in desperation. Hands shook as they fumbled for keys. Boots scraped against the pavement as they staggered toward escape. The engines roared to life, their once confident growl now frantic, uncontrolled. "Move!" Scarface's voice was raw, edged with fury and something else, something that hadn't been there before. Fear. He spun on his heel, his eyes darting between his men and the flashing lights that now flooded the street. They had no time. If they didn't get out now, it was over. Scarface turned, reaching for his bike. But it was too late. With a sharp screech of tires, the first patrol car blocked the street, cutting off their escape. The vehicle came to an abrupt stop, its doors already swinging open before the tires had even settled. A voice boomed through the night. "Freeze! Hands in the air!" Another squad car skidded in from the opposite side, trapping them completely. The gang had nowhere to go. The bikers hesitated, their bodies tensed, their eyes flickering between their leader and the officers pouring out of the vehicles. The cops moved fast, their weapons drawn, their expressions hard, unreadable. They had seen this before. They had dealt with men like these before. Down on the ground. Now, Scarface's hands trembled at his sides. his jaw clenched so tightly it looked as though it might snap, his mind racing, calculating, searching for a way out. But there was none. His men looked to him, waiting for a command, a plan, an order that would not come. Because there was nothing left to do. Slowly, Scarface raised his hands. One by one, the others followed. The night held its breath. The silence now filled only with the crackling of police radios, the low murmur of officers issuing orders, the clatter of metal as handcuffs snapped shut around wrists that had, minutes ago, been reaching for weapons. Scarface's hands were the last to be cuffed. The cold steel bit into his skin, a final, undeniable symbol of his defeat. And as he stood there, his chest heaving, his head swimming with the sting of humiliation, he finally looked up, and there, standing just beyond the line of police, was him, Jendrik, still standing, still watching. Scarface's lips curled back, something ugly and bitter twisting in his expression. He could feel the rage burning inside him, the raw humiliation of it searing into his bones. This wasn't supposed to happen. This shouldn't have happened. This man wasn't supposed to win. And yet, there he was. Scarface spat blood onto the pavement. His gaze locked onto the man he had mocked, the man he had underestimated, the dwarf who had refused to break, the man who had won. The cops shoved him into the back of the squad car, the door slamming shut with finality. It was over. The last of the Iron Claws were restrained, forced to their knees, their wrists bound, their pride shattered. The street, once filled with their roaring engines, was now filled only with their silence. And Jendrik? He exhaled. The breath left him in a slow, trembling sigh, his muscles finally releasing the tension that had held them hostage. His gaze dropped to the wolf. The beast stood exactly where it had been all along, its golden eyes still watching him, still steady, still unmoving. And in that moment, the weight of it all hit him. The exhaustion, the fear, the sheer insanity of the night. Then, without thinking, without hesitation, he dropped to his knees, and he wrapped his arms around his rescuer. The wolf did not move. It stood firm, letting him hold on, letting him breathe, letting him feel the warmth of something he had never felt before, protection. As if somehow it had always known. The night had ended, but Grimwood had changed forever. What had begun as a quiet evening had turned into something the town would never forget. The streets where people once walked without concern had become a battlefield, where the balance of power had been upended, rewritten, shattered. And at the center of it all was not a man, not a police force, not a weapon of law and order. It was a wolf. The Iron Claws had come looking for control, believing themselves to be unstoppable, their cruelty disguised as amusement, their mockery sharpened into weapons meant to break those they saw as beneath them. They had found only humiliation. They had found only their own downfall. And the town had watched. In the following days, whispers turned to rumors, rumors turned to stories, and stories became legend. People spoke in hushed, reverent tones about the beast that had emerged from the darkness, the protector that had defended a man the world had chosen to ignore. A wolf, massive and fearless, who had stood against the worst kind of men. They called it the shadow of Grimwood. Some claimed they had seen it before, lurking in the forests, watching from the edges of the town as if it had always been there, waiting for something for someone. Others whispered that it was no ordinary animal, that it was something older, something more than just a wolf, something with a purpose far beyond the instincts of the wild. But the wolf itself did not care. It did not wait for applause. It did not bask in the admiration of those who now feared it and respected it in equal measure. It simply was. It had come. It had done what was right. And now it was gone. No one saw it leave. One moment, it had been standing beside Jendrik, its golden eyes watching the aftermath of the chaos. And the next, vanished into the night. Some searched for it, hoping to catch one last glimpse of the beast that had challenged the untouchable. But the forest swallowed all traces of it. It had come from the shadows, and to the shadows it had returned. Yet, even in its absence, the fear it had left behind remained. For the Iron Claws, there was no escaping what had happened. The humiliation was permanent. a gang once feared, once known for their ability to bend the weak to their will, had been brought to their knees by a single creature, and worse, by a man they had mocked. The media had taken hold of the story, twisting the knife of their shame. Biker gang defeated by mysterious wolf in Grimwood. Outlaws brought down by unlikely hero. Justice in the form of fangs and fury. Their names were plastered in headlines, their faces broadcast for all to see. They had once thrived in their reputation, but now, they had become a joke. They had lost to an animal. And if there was anything men like them could never forgive, it was being made fools of. But no amount of anger, no amount of hatred, no amount of quiet, seething rage could change the truth. They had lost, and the world would never forget it. Jindrak walked through the streets of Grimwood, and for the first time in his life, people looked at him differently. Not with mockery, not with pity, with something else, with acknowledgement. The town had never been particularly cruel to him, but it had never truly seen him either. He had always been a curiosity, a novelty, an afterthought, something that existed in the background of other people's stories, a reminder of difference rather than an individual of his own. But now, he could feel the weight of respect in their glances. And yet, he knew the truth. They weren't looking at him. They were looking at the wolf that had stood beside him. It didn't matter what he had endured. It didn't matter that he had spent his life fighting battles they would never understand. The wolf had given them something they could comprehend. A story, a legend, a hero. And so they spoke of it. They whispered its name. They erased him from his own survival and replaced it with something they could admire without discomfort. Because the truth was too ugly. The truth was that the Iron Claws had not come for the wolf. They had come for him. The racism, the cruelty, the humiliation that had been for him. But the story? The story was always about something bigger. And maybe that was for the best. Maybe it was better that the people of Grimwood would never have to ask themselves why they had never stood up for him before. Maybe it was better that the wolf had taken the weight of a legend, that it had become the name people whispered with admiration instead of the name they had once spoken with amusement. Because the truth was uncomfortable. The truth was that people didn't like to face their own silence. And in the end, the wolf had simply done what no one else ever had. It had refused to look away. It had refused to let them win. It had not needed permission to fight. And that was what truly terrified them. Not the teeth, not the growl, not the sheer force of its body or the blood that had dripped from its fangs. It was the fact that it had not hesitated, that it had seen an injustice and had destroyed it without question, without guilt, without shame. Because the wolf did not ask for approval. It did not care if people thought Jindrak was worth saving. It did not weigh his value, did not consider whether or not he had earned the right to be defended. It simply had. And that was why the wolf had become a legend. Because deep down, everyone wished they had done the same. And yet, in the end, only the beast had acted.